I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Pete Phillips to us. Pete is a Methodist minister and an academic at the University of Durham, and he runs in particular their Codec Research Centre, which is specialising in the interface between theology and digital technology. So he's been thinking and writing about a lot of this stuff long before most of us have considered it, and has really come into his own, I suppose, over the lockdown. And what we wanted to start off is talking about churches and other places of worship. They've really taken to the internet in their droves to practice their faith during lockdown. Pete, I wanted to start off by asking, does this surprise you at all? Would you have predicted this in advance if you had known pre-lockdown it was coming, or is this exactly what you expected to happen?
Well, I think one of the things I first wrote during the pandemic was that the digital church has been online for ages, or the church has been online for ages. It's been lots of different places, so we can't say that digital church started, in March 2020. That's complete historical inaccuracy. It's been going on for decades, ever since there's been an internet. What certainly has happened is it's gone mainline during the pandemic when the church is closed. So the church had to go online because we had to have some form of engagement, or actually most religion had to go online because we wanted some kind of community engagement, because religion is about community. And if you're stopped from meeting together physically, you need to meet somewhere online or in some other form in order to continue that community engagement and to worship. So it's kind of expected. But the really exciting thing is what the opportunities that's given for the church to become a much wider experience for those with disabilities, those who are vulnerable, those who are normally housebound, who haven't been able to come to physical church, but suddenly can engage with online church, or hybrid church is another term that we're tending to use now, as we kind of have this mixed mode of physical and digital. And the other thing is the huge numbers of people who seem to be anonymous viewers coming along.
Do you think there's anything genuinely new or novel? Have you seen much innovation, or is it simply all churches getting on board with what some of the larger, richer, more tech-literate churches have been doing for years?
No, that's really interesting because, and I think it was actually caused by the way the pandemic happened, or the way the lockdown happened, in that the first week churches were allowed to film from within their buildings. And so we saw a kind of huge move onto YouTube and live viewing or live streaming of services. So what was happening in church suddenly came onto the TV screen, and you could sit at home and watch it. But then churches actually stopped. You weren't allowed to go into the buildings, or the churches generally agreed that they wouldn't go into buildings for safety reasons. And that meant you had to have much more pre-recorded material with a shorter format, 40 to 45 minutes as normal, with different parts of the liturgy included, prayers, readings and sermons and so on, stuff for kids and so on. And worship leaders singing, live and engaging the congregations with their words. But then you also saw lots of other forms. So Zoom church began, where families would meet in each of these kind of small boxes. And it's like celebrity squares, but celebrity families, yeah? So you had kind of lots of different boxes of people in their homes engaging, and kids running around, a dog and cats and everything. So the real kind of community became kind of a domestic experience. We had bishops doing Eucharist or communion from their kitchen tables. And there was some kind of, there was a bit of criticism around saying about, domestic worship, ridiculous, yeah? But of course, that's where the church started 2,000 years ago, in domestic homes throughout the Roman Empire. And so it's actually kind of a flipping back to the early church. And this sense of domesticated church has been one of the kind of revelations of the pandemic so far.
You mentioned earlier that perhaps the online streaming was also tapping into a different pool of people from those who would normally attend in person. Do you think that something about the anonymity of an online stream allows people who are kind of, vicariously interested in religion but wouldn't call themselves believers to take part in a way they might not have done before?
That definitely seems to be what's happening. We've had we're doing some research with Savanta Comres at the moment, a kind of rolling 4-month poll. And that's kind of shown figures between 27 and 29% of people engaging with online worship. Now, if you think of normal church attendance is about 9%, and a third of normal attendees don't do online worship for whatever reason, then you're talking about a fourfold increase in the numbers of people who are coming to church. If you think about the UK in general, that's an extra 20 million people attending online worship. That's a huge figure, and that figure is replicated across different polls, and also in Gladys Ganiel's report, People Still Need Us, in Ireland, or the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland and Era, and then her figure was about 25%. So we do see this now across the Great Britain and Era, of a huge increase in people coming along and engaging in online worship across all religions. This is not just the church, and that's really, I think, it's because the pandemic makes everybody scared, and they want to turn to something which they feel is reassuring. They turn to God in prayer, but also because they've got time in their hands. They want to see what things are about. But there does seem to be intentionality here as well, because people could have just watched another Netflix series, yeah, or they could have just gone off and watched whatever they wanted to do on YouTube. But there seems to be an intentional turning to religious things and online worship, online religious practice, because that's what people are searching for.
Do you think there's a risk as well, though, that the churches might lose some of their previously more nominal people who came very much for the community aspect, for whom church was as much a communitarian thing as a spiritual thing, and they're not quite getting that from these online alternatives? So is there almost potentially a shifting in the composition of your Agglomeration congregation?
Yeah, I mean, there's the really striking thing is, and yes, that there will be the sense that will your offline congregation be as big as your online congregation? No, it won't. But will it be the case that people are finding more community online? They want this to continue. So there's a recent poll in, I think it's the Church of Wales, where something like 70% of the church intended to continue online engagement. The feeling was the same in the Church of Scotland, for a vote that they took there. A number of people, 15 to 20% of people were going to stop doing online, but 70% were going to continue, because actually they found that suddenly they were talking more with their people, engaging more with the church, and the sense of community was going up rather than going down. Because if you're talking like this and having a conversation with people in church, rather than simply sat there in a pew looking at the back of somebody else's head, this might be an actually richer form of engagement. Even in the massive churches, the mega churches, you go to a church with 3,000 people, you may not actually meet very many people there. So this might be a richer form of engagement for community. That's what we seem to think.
Do you think there's also some kind of agglomeration effects? Because I've heard of some of the larger, more successful, famous churches reporting even as larger, 10 times the numbers they might already get. I wonder whether have you seen any evidence for people potentially, now that they're liberated from having to drive or travel, they can literally pick any church in the entire country, that there are some people who are switching from their existing local parish church to attend some of these more whizzy, high production values, huge resources, sucking away believers from their previous smaller churches?
Yeah. So let's be clear. We mustn't. We're doing polling figures for online panel. That's where we get the 29% figure from. So it's not that churches are feeding in numbers to us and saying, "Oh, look how millions of people are coming to our church." It's actually individuals on an online panel saying, "I'm attending online church." Yep. So it's not how many services they're going to. It's not, are you going to 23 million different churches every Sunday? It's, are you engaging? So that I think gives some. It's not an agglomeration there. It's not people saying I'm going to multiple forms of this. But I think people are hopping around. There are lots of places. My own geographical area here. There's some churches online, but my Methodist church isn't online, and so we go to somewhere else to worship because we have to. That's how we have to engage, and we're locked in and locked down. Sorry, and that's just our choice. But I think agglomeration is actually a red herring. The much bigger thing is people are coming to church or coming to religious engagement, worship activities of their own choice, because they can watch it when they want to, how they want to, from the freedom of their own living rooms, as it were. They can come to church in their pajamas. There's a story going around being used by a lot of people now of somebody saying, "You've given us a pew behind the back pew, okay, somewhere I can sit and watch what you're doing and get used to you," and that's an interesting thing. Where church have been doing this for years, they found that new people who come to the church say to them, "Oh, we've been watching you online for 3 months." Yep. So they've engaged with the church, they found out what the church is about, and then they've decided they actually want to come to physical church because it's no longer a scary place. People don't really know what happens in a mosque or a synagogue or a church. They're fearful places because they're strange places to many people. And so if you can kind of look in from the safety of your front room, you can engage in something that's new.
You said earlier in the lockdown that you thought even the type of technology that a church chooses to put its services on could unintentionally change something about the nature of the community. So, for example, if a church is doing kind of pre-recorded live streams, it's very outward focused, but it's very consumption, you passively consume. Whereas if you do a Zoom or a Skype service, it's very more inward focused, but everyone is taking part. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you've seen that kind of play out over the last few months?
Yeah, so technology always drives the way that you perform. McLuhan said the medium is the message. So you've got to be very, very careful that we actually don't fall into that kind of trap. Church is about community. We're the body of Christ. All religions are about community and about a community of people who are gathering together to worship God. And so to some extent, you've got to be careful that you're not driven by the technology that you're forced into. It's just the same as church. Church buildings are a technology in themselves, and we can be forced to kind of play to those models of technology as well. So a lot of people are kind of still doing the live stream, and that's a good way of doing it, but actually using more and more people from the congregation to do parts of the service, a much more kind of community-centered way of doing it. Having, Maud doing the reading, or Fred doing the prayers, or, the children doing an activity or something like that. So you get to see lots of different people and you make it a community experience. Zoom Church allows that as well, to focus on different people and different squares and what have you at different times. But also people are adding things like doing live stream, but then switching to a Zoom coffee time afterwards. So you actually get community engagement after the church service or after the synagogue meeting or whatever. So this sense of, it's not just performance, it's not just filming, it's not just looking at a camera, it's actually meeting other people and engaging with them in our religion.
Do you think the technology of doing things online will be quite disruptive to other parts of religious practice? I mean, to pick one example, there's been a lot of debate, as you know better than me, within some Christian churches about how one does communion through the internet. And some denominations say not possible, has to be physically present, and others say, actually, let's experiment. Do you expect the pandemic to have any lasting effect and starting to disrupt and change long-standing religious practice like that?
Well, I think the pandemic will disrupt things. That's disrupted all of our experience, and whatever happens, in whatever's going to happen, we don't know what the new normal is. We don't know whether the pandemic will continue or come back or whatever. So we will always be kind of living in the contingency of where we are, and that means we actually have to adjust our religious practice to those contingencies, to where we find ourselves. I think that hybrid church, this sense of mixture of physical and digital, won't go away. because people have actually found that they can come to church on their own terms. That they don't necessarily have to come out in the, I'm up in the north, it's always freezing cold up here, isn't it? Grim up north. But they don't have to come out in the rain and the cold and what have you. They can actually sit in the safety of their homes and engage if they want to. Or if they're away, they can engage in an online service as well. So they don't have to miss going to church if they're away on business or on holiday or so on. They don't have to miss out on the community. So digital and physical together gives a wealth of opportunities for us to engage. And I think it will become the new normal. That will mean that we need to make sure that that hybrid church is itself properly sacramental. So for in the Christian church, that means Eucharist, baptism, reconciliation, confession, what have you. These things need to be brought into the physical, into the spirit, online area, as well as on the physical. Some churches have already gone there. The Lutherans, Presbyterians, some Lutherans, the Irish Methodists, they've gone that way already. We may need to do that for others as well. We may need to see that shift for others as well.
Mm. Do you think there's going to be a lot of kind of squabbles and fighting about this? Because I know that, for example, there are large parts of the Anglican Church who are very, very resistant to the idea that what they would see as tearing up 2,000 years of teaching on the Eucharist to allow lay people to receive in their own homes. Do you think that could become a flashpoint in the future?
The church is good at squabbling over things, and I think that yes, there will be people who will resist the shift. But I think it's quite interesting to see how the people develop new forms of religion and new forms of engagement for a digital world. And I think that's what we may be seeing here, a new Reformation beginning to take hold. The last Reformation, of course, happened around the change to print culture. And the rise of print culture. I mean, the printing press and the Reformation happened at the same time for other reasons. I think it's a renaissance. It's not really just about the printing press. But we're now entering a completely different kind of culture and a different society and a different outlook. And we've also got a new generation who are rising up, the Gen Zs and millennials, who are far more spiritually minded than us old Gen Xers, who are so resistant to religion. And I think that will mean that there will be a change of religious practice that we'll see roll out. Yes, there will be those who want to stick to their old conservative ways, small c, and continue with traditional practices. But I think that it's an exciting time to see what's happening across the board in religion, and see how new forms of religion will continue as people seek to worship God.
And I understand you've got some interesting new findings from some surveys that comrades Savanta have been doing, which you're able to share with us about how people are engaging with some of these new forms of religion online and other digital technologies.
Yeah, that's right. So I've just closed one down. I'll just share a screen in a moment. I just need to kind of make sure it's open. It's gone to a different blade. So what we're finding is that we've got we've done two months now of surveys around how people engage with worship and online worship. So I'll just share the screen, and then I'll just have to shift the screen around a little bit. I'm sorry. So can you see that there?
Yes.
Yeah, you can. So let me just zoom into a small part of that, and it's this chart here that I want to show you. So this is we asked an online panel what their experience was of online worship during the lockdown, and you can see here we've got 2 months now for July and then for August. Now these are banded in age groups, and what's really interesting is that bottom age group of the young people. We'll see online prayer activity in July is 45% among 18 to 24-year-olds, 49% among 25 to 34-year-olds. And that's around just almost a half of young people praying regularly. No, that's regularly in statistic terms. That means once a month because of the link to religious engagement online. But that's still high. And notice how it goes up in August, which is interesting. In August, it's up to 55% and 54%. So actually, there's a huge link here with what's happening amongst this Gen Z and the millennials at the moment. A huge rise in that, and of course, that's across all religions. That's not just Christianity. But then, as you get older, the engagement is dropping off, and that's very interesting as well. These figures are reflected as well in the offline prayer and so on. So our older generations aren't praying regularly. Only a tenth of them are. Whereas actually it's the young people who are praying much more. And then you switch over to worship in the middle here, and you'll see that online engagement in worship is up to, in August, is up to over half of young people engaging in online worship. Okay, that's staggering. That figure is complete. When I got these a couple of days ago from Savannah Comrades, I was just shocked by that. And notice the next one is engagement with nature, which is kind of the big one at the moment, in that's where people are getting their spiritual engagement, their online faith-related activities through the celebration of nature and through engagement with nature. But you look, the online worship activity is now almost the same as engagement with nature. Or the reflection on nature, meditation on nature, which is really interesting. Again, young people on online choirs and yoga and what have you as well, and meditation. All these are going up. That links with Youth for Christ's recent research as well. Z2A of worship. Sorry, I can't see it because thanks for Zoom. They've just brought out a big research. A book on research where they're talking about Gen Z being an open generation rather than a missing generation. That we really need to look at what's happening amongst the young in the UK about faith, because that may be where there's a blossoming of faith and spirituality of some kind.
Just lastly then, to wrap this up, these are quite, as you say, these are kind of striking figures given the kind of the decades-long decline in church attendance, which is exacerbated among the young. And pre-COVID, the older you were, the more likely you were to attend a church in person. Do you think the internet and what's happened over the last few months is it going to be a blip, or does it actually start to change and arrest this kind of long-term decline in attendance?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a $6 million question, isn't it? And I think it's very, very interesting that we're having a lot of people coming to online church, and the reason people come to church, Pew Research told us 62% of people, when you ask them why are you attending a religious service, is because they want to be closer to God. Okay, and I think the big thing for me over the turn down has been a turn to God. Yeah. I don't think it matters about the church so much. I don't think it matters about the individual faiths and what have you. But this sense that people have decided that actually God's a serious thing to take hold of, a serious idea to get hold of, and that they want to come to church to be closer to what their understanding is of God. And that means that impacts all religions. Also, I think, so can I just say one other thing about places? I'm very intrigued that in the research as well, London is the capital for faith in the UK, followed by the West Midlands. I don't think it's, and then Yorkshire. I don't think it's a coincidence that those are centres of multicultural engagement and multi-faith engagement. I think that multiculturalism is good for faith, where faiths work together and share together and pray together. And I think that sense of a community which is multicultural tends towards greater faith engagement, and that's good for us. I think that's something we need to rejoice in.
Just one quick question we've had in the chat. Paul's asking, just to clarify, in your original chart, that's 45% of all 18 to 24-year-olds who said they've prayed at least once a month.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
and those figures are, it's an open panel of is not a Christian panel. It's a completely open panel, representative panel with comrades.
Remarkable numbers. Thanks so much, Pete. That's been fascinating to hear some of your thoughts and your reflections and some of the evidence on that. We're going to bring in a few other different voices to kind of reflect on that. First, I want to introduce Rabbi Laura Janner-Klausner. Rabbi Laura is the senior rabbi for Reform Judaism in the UK, who have been doing some interesting things online. Rabbi Laura, I wanted to ask you, just do you have any reflections on what you've been hearing? How does the Jewish experience on taking faith online during lockdown, how do you think it compares to some of the things that Pete's been talking about? Are there lots of similarities, or has it been quite different in your experience?
So they do echo some of the things that Pete was talking about. The leap onto online for people who never thought they could has been amazing. Our clergy have been brilliantly creative. We do not have the same issues around the Eucharist, communion. Our issues tend to be about what can count as a prayer quorum and what can't. And of course, the main dividing line is those Jews who will actively use electricity on Shabbat and on festivals. So the huge chasm that has happened is between those progressive communities who used to always, many of us who used to live stream, and those Orthodox communities. But even the Orthodox communities are using it in the weekdays, and they are using it for the first part of the service on Friday night until they get to the absolute moment of Shabbat. So they've also seen that the use of online, people want to be engaged online. We've had loads of people being engaged in a way we've never seen before. And it's interesting, I also found those statistics that Pete just put up really stunning. And you were saying it's cross religion. I'm hoping, not just that Jews were asked, obviously, but I'm really hoping that our young people are also doing that, because that would be wonderful for the future. So one of our issues has been who uses electricity. The other one is what counts as a quorum. And the other issue that's been a sort of flashpoint has been around whether you can say the memorial prayer. Some people saying you can only do it in person, it has a different status. And a few of our clergy are very worried that people actually won't rock back into synagogue because it's so easy to go online. However, I think that there has been a depletion of joy in it, and people are really yearning to be back together. We've also done it differently. I'm sorry about the plane, very unusual now, because their whole issues about coming back into places of worship, we've been pretty stringent about it, because you do need at least 10 Jews, male if you're Orthodox, and not for us, because women do count. So the whole issue around having face coverings, not being able to sing is very difficult for us, because it's part of the commandment to hear the voice. I'm trying to find something similar-ish to the communion, that might be near it. And the big thing for us coming up is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the High Holy Days, because it is a commandment to hear the shofar, the ram's horn, which of course is a trumpet. So can you actually blow the trumpet because of COVID or not? So it's been very interesting. We've had loads of engagement in funerals, by the way, but we haven't had what I've seen happening in the churches, which I think Pete has been brilliant on, by the way. I can say that because he can't say that about himself. And that's been very fascinating. And that will, it seems to me as an outsider, have an impact on Christianity long term. And from my point of view, or from our point of view, there's no going back from this. It is impossible for anyone to argue, oh, we're not having online in the future. We will have the dual thing that Pete also talked about, because by definition, who are you excluding if you say only the people who can come in? You are excluding the people who your values, or our values, most people's values, are set to focus upon. People who are less mobile, people who are more peripheral. So what are you going to say? We're going to be inclusive, but we're not going to include the people who actually can't make it. So we are changing Judaism, and there's been also loads of people, I'm happy to say, from the point of view of market share, really horrible way of looking at it, who are like, whoa, we love progressive Judaism now because it's real and we can be involved, particularly at the Seder. The Seder, the Passover Seder is the number one kept ritual in Judaism. 92% of Anglo-Jews, British Jews, keep it. And this whole thing about you can't have a Zoom with your family. So people will be in Orthodox synagogues and will, from my point of view, compromise a lot of other things. They're not going to compromise being with their child, who they couldn't be with at Passover, by Zoom. And that was a moment of truth that people were like, okay, I don't really keep all of it, and so let's do it. So for us as progressive Jews, it's been a bit of a boon. There we are.
Because obviously there's large numbers, as there are of Christians in this country, there are large numbers of people from Jewish heritage who aren't practicing. But have you seen many people who have never come to any form of progressive or Orthodox Judaism who have been tempted back because it's so easy just to log in and view something going on Shabbat?
Yes, and not having to pay membership or anything like that. Also, Jews are not a faith. We are a religious civilization. So it's completely fine to be Jewish and not believe in God at all. We're a completely different being in that way than Christianity or Islam, actually. Although Islam is more religious civilization-y because of the peoplehood aspect. So our synagogues have turned into Jewish community centres, but that's what we are. We are Jewish community centres where prayer is only 1/3 of what we're really meant to be doing. So the in-gathering has happened. But Jews have also, we had a Limud, which is this conference that we have over Christmas, is the big one, when Jews are kind of escaping Christmas. About 3,000 people come to Birmingham at the moment. So we've had Limud online, thousands of people. So I think Jews have been super keen on being involved, all ages, and it's changed the community for good.
Thank you so much, Laura. That's really fascinating.
Really, 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 really missing being in presence of each other. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I think that's shared across many, many groups for sure. I also wanted to then bring in Azim Ahmed. Azim is a research associate for the Centre of the Study of Islam at Cardiff University. And obviously, I wanted to give you a chance, Azim, to kind of reflect on some of the things you've been hearing and weigh that with your own experience, particularly in Cardiff and what you've seen in mosques there. How have Muslims, in your experience, adjusted to this new normal we keep hearing about? Have you seen points of similarity with what Pete and what Laura were saying?
It was a really interesting presentation as well. Thank you, Pete and Laura. It was quite, I think, surprising, some of those statistics. But as I think some have been discussing in the group chat, it really does tie in with some of the research and findings, which kind of do indicate that the idea of a secularized kind of younger generation isn't quite holding true. There's a lot more complexity there than expected. In terms of the Muslim community, I think there's a few shaping factors that are worth keeping in mind, which affect the kind of online engagement. The first is the kind of migration experience and background of many Muslims. So being from kind of countries abroad and having family and links back to those countries means they've already adapted to maintaining relationships and links across physical boundaries. So some of these skills, technologies, adapted uses are already there amongst the Muslim community and were simply reapplied when it came to the case of social distancing locally because of the pandemic. And I think that's been one factor that's in place. So when we're talking about sometimes things like video technology, there's a surprising amount of literacy amongst the Muslim population because of the fact they've had to have this type of engagement prior. And I think the second factor is the age demographic. So 2011 census, which is getting a bit dated now, but I think still tells us the trends involved, shows that about half the population is British born in terms of Muslims and half of under the age of 25. So they would have obviously matured in the last 10 years, but you still have this very significant age gap between quite a small older population, but a very young and youthful population, much younger than the general population as a whole. And these individuals are digital natives. They're the millennials and Generation Z, and the kind of phrases applied to that younger digital native, very highly digitally literate individuals. And again, for them, digital worship was not something they separated out from worship as a whole. They would already be engaged with online platforms from YouTube to Instagram to Facebook. And what these kind of two things come together to mean is that when it came to the digital shift, or when it came to lockdown, there was a degree of skill and familiarity already present, and things were kind of shifting on the ground more naturally rather than abruptly. And I think one of the things I just wanted to throw in, because we've been speaking about the internet, we've been speaking about kind of social media and new technologies. Sometimes this has been managed through older technologies. So one of the things many mosques have in place is a private radio communicator. And this was used by my parents' generation and many of the first generation of Muslims to make announcements about funerals, to issue a call to prayer, and just a way of kind of recreating the experience of being able to hear the adhan, the call to prayer, and other the kind of audio aspects of worship when you're not at the mosque, especially as important for the female population. So these kind of fell out of use. This technology was still there, but it fell out of use in recent years with the internet. But after lockdown, many people returned back to these, dusted off the old radio frequency kind of receivers, set them up again. And what you had was a much stronger resurgence of use of these kind of radio transmitters. And I found that fascinating, especially coming from a kind of position where I was expecting, YouTube broadcasts and such, to see kind of radio transmitters being used much more frequently. So I think that's kind of maybe part of the picture. In terms of worship, much like Laura, some of the debates have kind of outlined, or rather made it clear that kind of the worship itself, in terms of the ritual worship, not much of that is done online. But in terms of lectures, classes, and simply just what you might call services, ways of engaging with the kind of religious institution, that has moved online. And as a kind of final reflection, unless you have any further questions, I was kind of surprised to hear that a lot of the churches from the research seem to have larger congregations. Some of that has been the picture we've had locally as well from church groups, that they've said, they've had a much stronger resurgence in the congregation. I've struggled to find any statistics on this, but certainly speaking to imams from across the country, mosques from across the country, and councils of mosques as well, it's been the opposite within the Muslim community. So the amount of engagement online hasn't met and reflected the type of physical engagement that would take place in a mosque usually. And I think part of this is simply the nature of worship. Muslim worship did have their kind of weekly big events like the Friday prayer, but much more popular and much more common were things like the everyday use, popping in for a few quiet minutes of prayer during the working day, going during the working day again, or at the end of your school or university sessions for one of the prayers before you go home. And so that rhythmic everyday use has been really interrupted and lost. And that has implications, especially for things like funding. Mosques, I think, are facing a funding crisis because while, digitally you can recreate many things, it hasn't recreated those networks for support which mosques rely on for running. So I think those are some kind of brief observations, but it's been a really interesting, I think, picture in terms of the shift online across religious groups.
Thanks so much, Azim. It's been really interesting to hear some of the similarities and differences. I wanted to throw this conversation open to some of our people listening in. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Pete or either of our guests, do you want to just wave a hand or pop it in the chat, and we can come and unmute you and ask a question. Sophie Gregory.
Hiya. I'm just wondering, we've been speaking a little bit about moving religion online and digital worship, but I think one of the things that we know about faith is that it also has a very practical manifestation of serving your local communities and serving humanity, and really taking these values of love, fellowship, generosity, patience, and using them to serve the people around us who aren't necessarily within our religious communities. I'm just wondering whether, since moving online, since that local element has maybe shifted, how we might now navigate the more practical elements of faith in terms of looking more outwardly, whether that means that we'll move to bigger kind of areas of practical service, or whether it will still remain within the local community. Whether that shift geographically online will also then manifest geographically offline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a question. Pete, do you want to have a chat about that?
Yeah, sure. So there've been some really important things in the Church Times from Alice Worley and others who've pointed out the importance of social justice and social action throughout the pandemic. Lots and lots of churches have engaged in, helping COVID-19 groups, helping with meals, seek distribution of food in various places and so on. So that continues and goes on. We mustn't feel that the church has suddenly disappeared on the web. Yes, there is online, but I'll keep going on about this hybrid church. And that's a hybrid church which is both physical and digital, that the two have to go in. I don't think you can have an expression of church which is wholly non-physical. I mean, in the end, we're all physical, we're all here online. So there's an academic piece here on what we mean by online, in any case, is that being non-physical. But you also get people who are providing live stream services and then providing phone a sermon, on old style phones. The Church of England got involved with this with dial a help service, where you could phone for services or hymns or what have you. Vicars carrying, printing off the orders of service and carrying it around their village in order to put it through everybody's notice letterbox, so they could read paper service while the live stream was happening and so on. So social engagement, absolutely crucial. Community engagement, absolutely central. One of the most digital people I know, Joanne Cox-Darling up in the West Midlands, engaged in putting a blackboard at the end of her garden path and writing on this every day and providing people who are going past up and down this main road with badges and things like that, and support the NHS and everything. These things are absolutely central to the church's acts of witness and social justice, and that won't be going anywhere, I don't think. The whole thing is, how do you bring a community together that is engaging both online and offline? And I think that's the trick, or that's the thing that the churches and other religions as well will need to get hold of. How do you make one community and one community engagement from a dispersed community on and offline?
Azim, I think you wanted to come in on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Sophie, that's a really, I think, interesting and important question. One of the things I've seen locally, and this has been across the board, has been kind of various initiatives places of worship ran during the lockdown, such as, delivery of food packages to those who are shielding, setting up wider food banks, larger than normal because of expected kind of economic downturn, and also kind of volunteer groups which kind of set up and worked with local kind of Facebook groups and similar, or Nextdoor, which is a local website, to kind of respond to needs, whether it was picking up a pharmacy prescription or helping with any particular query, and also just things like loneliness. So a lot of that, while it's happened, I have to reflect, has been local in the sense of it's relied on local networks, local knowledge, local connectivity, and has been able to run because there was a dispensation, at least in the Welsh regulations, to allow places of worship to still offer kind of vital community services during the lockdown. And I think the only aspect of the kind of online shift is that you can't really maintain and keep those relationships online because they're locally embedded. You can maybe do a national campaign, but very often it's about having those immediate kind of relationships with people in your neighborhood and knowledge. So while that has been continuing, I think one of the dangers is any continued, sort of lockdown or a repeat of a lockdown may lose that local knowledge and those local relationships, which mean, the delivery of services can be done in this very kind of sort of people-focused way.
I think there's a really interesting tension there, because I think you're absolutely right, Azim, that the lockdown has certainly focused people's attentions. Certainly where we were all confined to our houses, our sphere of influence shrunk just to maybe where you could walk in 5 minutes from your front door. But at the same time, the internet also kind of dislocates the connection between geographical and religious practice, because you can now attend a church that's hundreds, if not thousands of miles away online. I've heard of people who are joining in kind of evangelistic courses, not based on because this church is nearby, but because a friend of a friend recommended it to them. And then the question to the clergy is, how do you build a relationship with someone who you can never see physically face to face because they're so far away? So I think it'll be fascinating to see both the kind of local and the national almost growing as a result of some of the unexpected changes in lockdown. Are there any other questions from anyone else on the call who'd like to chip in? You want to raise your hand or make yourself otherwise available? Madeline. Oh, there we go.
I was the one who had to say it. I think I'm muted. Yeah, so as I said in the chat, obviously Theos has done some polling, which has generally lower numbers than this, but I can send you the links to that, and I don't really dwell on that. My question is more about the hybrid and what the hybrid looks like, in that obviously the best case scenario would be that a hybrid situation would have the best of both, but I think a lot of people would be concerned that it would have the worst of both, in that I've seen lots of people talking about online meetings. There's been a kind of unexpected equality of everybody being in the same situation online, and actually that's quite different from being the one person in the room that's not there. So I'm just wondering really from all the panelists if they've heard of early signs of how that's going, and how people are responding to that either positively or negatively, also in terms of best practice examples. And I'm particularly thinking, it was mentioned, how do you make one community, particularly around the Eucharist, when people actually just have different theologies and might feel quite uncomfortable about that move? Might we see that being a more painful hybrid situation than we would hope? Could there be fractures of community there as well, I suppose? I'm sort of just interested to hear more thoughts on that tension.
Thanks, Madeline. Who wants to come in on that one? Pete?
Hi, thanks, Madeline. I think so we don't know where we're going with hybrid at the moment. This morning I've been mapping out a paper with a friend about what we think hybrid might look like. There are churches around the place which are exploring it, and there are churches in the States who are exploring it as well, but also churches in Singapore and Australia and what have you. There is a kind of global sense that we need to incorporate digital into the work that we do. But how do we do that to actually allow democracy, yes, but also representation? A lot of the disabled community come to us and say, hey, hold on a minute, we've been excluded from physical church for the last, goodness knows how long, yet now we're equal part. We can say that about other communities which have felt excluded as well. And the whole thing about Eucharist and online Eucharist includes, but a physical Eucharist, or where priests are only allowed to consume the elements, whereas the congregation are told to pray a prayer for spiritual communion, is itself very divisive, in that you split apart the clergy from the lay people in the church. And of course, we've fought over communion for centuries, about the core ritual that's part and parcel of what we're doing. We need to remember it's a spiritual thing as well, and spiritual isn't confined to physical. So there is this kind of besottedness with physicality within our world. God Himself is a spirit, and yet we seem to kind of only want to take part in those things which are physical. We don't believe in the church as a temple. We believe that the church is the community. And I think that the big thing, that where really your point presses hard, is how do we stop online community and physical community being different from one another? How can we be co-represented in the same room? Even if you have a business meeting and you have kind of 3 or 4 people in the room physically and 3 or 4 people on the Zoom screen, there is a difference of presence. And we've known that for ages through the academic stuff on digital engagement and so on. And just before the pandemic, there was this kind of emerging kind of agreement from MIT and what have you, that video conferences weren't good for business. Okay, and suddenly that's all been hidden away. It's all kind of gone back. But there does need to be scientific engagement and technological engagement with community presence online, and how we can feel present, even though we are not physically present. So that social presence needs to go both ways. And I just don't think we're just not there technologically yet. But I see 1 or 2 places beginning to look at how we might develop that, and it'll be a very exciting few months as we push that forward. But we need people in care homes to be part of the physical church. We need to lament what's happened, and we need to include people who've been through those experiences of death and bereavement and horror in the church community, rather than saying, no, you can't come because physically you're distanced from us. Yeah? how do we include all people in, especially those who've not been included in the past? And that for me is the core point for hybrid models of religion, inclusion.
Thanks, Pete. There's another interesting question in the chat that Ben Rich has put in. He says that at his synagogue, the online congregation is larger, but is lacking some of the more committed pre-COVID members, and he's worried about whether the kind of activist congregation members are being replaced with day shoppers. Has anyone else experienced that in their own community? I don't know, Rabbi Laura, if you've got any thoughts on whether that's happening in your experience.
Yes, it's a good point that Ben brought up. And actually, he's in York. Someone said that to me in Leeds when I was there yesterday. So, which is kind of an amazing coincidence. So near and everything. I think people are tiring. I think the group of people initially were keen, and then they started to drift away because they really miss community, because they know what in-person community is. Other people who weren't so involved are still involved. There's a very interesting, I was just thinking about what Pete was saying about technology. There's a very interesting tech being developed in the virtual exhibition world, which might be worth religious folks looking at, because they are looking at simultaneous, how to get that feeling that even if you're online in one place or another, not having that gap, but there is really simultaneous sound so that you can speak together. Because the big thing about conferences is, of course, networking, and the difference in conference world and our world is there's a lot of money. So it might be worth finding a way of working with the virtual conference world in order to improve the experience, so that hybrid is different.
Any other thoughts on this particular issue that people want to chip in on?
I think that it is true, but the other thing that's happened in a lot of the churches is people moving on to morning prayer and rites of prayer through the day. So discipleship seems to have kind of gone through the roof. You could normally have a vicar who met in his or her parish church of the morning with 2 or 3 faithful congregants. Online, that's becoming a dozen or 2 dozen or what have you, attending morning prayer, evening prayer, compline. And that means that it's not the day shoppers. Actually, people are changing their pattern of religion from it being a kind of Sunday only thing to it being a much more kind of everyday engagement and a whole life engagement with spirituality. That can only be a good thing, I think.
Yeah.
Laura?
Yeah, yes, we've got loads of keynotes. It's absolutely fantastic. Coming in the morning, coming in the evening, because we pray 3 times a day, but it's in effect twice because we smush afternoon and evening together. But we do have communities who, if we now went offline, would be, hurt, actually. So yes, there is a lot of people bookending their day by services. And what's also brilliant, which I love, is lay people leading those services because they don't feel that they need the skills of Shabbat. So we are seeing, as are Orthodox, and by the way, my Orthodox colleagues, some of them, the geeky ones, off the scale doing brilliantly every single day from their houses. So I think that daily pattern, please God, will also change the pattern of how people relate to Judaism, because it's not a Shabbat religion at all. It's like that's a part of it. And we've become so narrow and boring to assess Judaism. Do you go to synagogue on a Friday night? No, Judaism is so much bigger. So I think this has rebooted Judaism.
Azim, you wanted to come in there.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but now I just had some reflections on, I think, Stephen's comments in the group chat, which I think are really important. I think one is the aspect of digital exclusion. So I feel like I'm a bit of a digital naysayer almost, but I don't intend to. I think there's lots of benefits, but there are, I think, some serious drawbacks. And I think one of those is digital exclusion, who isn't able to join or doesn't want to join. And I think part of that is not just people who are maybe older and less digitally literate, but we're also seeing different bodies of people who, for different reasons, don't feel comfortable using this kind of digital engagement system because maybe it's not giving them what they need. There's an old concept in kind of classical Islamic studies of suhba or companionship, and companionship with, friends, colleagues, or a sheikh, being a way of healing and nourishment and edification in times of trouble. And one of the things which definitely has come up is that you can't recreate that sense of suhba, that sense of companionship, collegiality and support through the online. And I think that's something which is a national mental health working group for Muslim organizations. And that's come up repeatedly, that, many people who in the midst of a mental health crisis would usually turn to their place of worship for that sense of support and a network to step in. They haven't been able to access that, and that can't really be accessed digitally for different reasons, including the kind of the publicness of it. It's much more easy to have private support in the context of a space. So I think there are real dangers there. And I think, Stephen's comments in the group chat do highlight some of those. So I think any move as well towards blended really needs to think about, what do we lose in the process of going online? And much like Stephen, I think we're having this conversation within universities at the moment about blended teaching for the next term. And the list of things that we won't be able to do or won't be able to support students with is quite extensive, and I think it's the same for places of worship.